artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello and welcome to episode 210. Wow, we've been going over 2 years now. What a journey. We just keep getting more relevant and more useful. My guest today is Matt Beane, assistant professor in the technology management program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he has spent over a decade doing extensive field research, which we'll hear all about, on how workers, organizations, and even AI defy norms and rules in the 21st century. He has a new book called The Skill Code, How to Save Human Ability in an Age of Intelligent Machines, which was just published by Harper Business. And he has given you a special deal as a listener to this podcast to get a free copy of the first chapter. Details at the end of the show. His book lays out a plan for us to protect our skills, and by extension, the human connection between experts and novices, which is the foundation of skill building, even as AI continues to take hold in our lives. So let's get into the interview. Matt Beane, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You, and I'm fascinated by your book, which is taking the future of work, which is the hardest of hot topics now, in the direction of learning. And I also read your PhD thesis, which the book builds upon considerably, makes it far more accessible, wider audiences. Maybe you could give us an introduction to how you got into this field, which obviously matters so much to you.
Sure. I think this a two-part answer to that question. So the approximate answer is that I was a partner in a small consulting firm that helped executive teams deal with complex and sometimes fraught team dynamics in the 90s and then into the mid-2000s. And during that work, I would say towards the early 2000s part of it, I saw the advent of a bunch of new digital communications tech that was really changing the way that these teams interacted. So the BlackBerry arrived, for instance, right? Sort of the smartphone and then the iPhone. And how difficult conversations occurred, what they were about, how they got done, that all just really shifted rather radically to significant consequence. At the same time, I started to get curious about tech. The other way of answering this question is I've been obsessed about technology and how we deal with it and how it reshapes us since I was a tiny little kid. I mean, every chance I could get to read anything about it and learn anything. Anyway, I started to read research, just like who was studying, okay, well, I'm seeing this stuff on the ground, who's studying this stuff, and found my way to a book called Honest Signals by a guy named Sandy Pentland, who's at the MIT Media Lab. And that really spun my head around. I had found a couple of papers before then, one of which was on something that I think was called meeting mediator or meeting mentor, basically a technology where each participant in a meeting had a smartphone display in front of them. And based on this sensor that people were wearing around their neck, it would give you real-time feedback visually on how much time you were taking in the conversation compared to others, and how good a job you were doing at taking turns and with whom in the conversation. And the net effect of that is that it instantly leveled participation in those groups right away. Like normally in a group, you get somebody who's just willing to talk that much more than everybody else. And that is not good for collective team performance in general. And something like between 30 and 40% of my very well-paid job was showing up in groups and leveling their participation. So I saw this system get implemented and went, wow, my field has a half-life. Like this is going to be automated to some degree. And so it was around then, maybe 2007, 2008, I started to really read broadly, found Ray Kurzweil's work and had I took it with a grain of salt, as one should. But I volunteered as a research associate for Amara Angelica, who's his director of research, started to do work testing whether this Moore's law curve was in fact extrapolating the way that everybody thought it might. And it was filling so much of my cognitive space. One day, my wife just sort of turned to me and said, you're walking around the living room talking about this stuff. You should just go back to school. And I said, it was a terrible time for me to do that. She was founding a business of her own at the time. And she's incredible. She gave me this look and said, so when's a better time? So I applied to school and MIT let me in. And in that application, I said that we have used technology to radically reconfigure our world, but we ain't seen nothing yet, basically. It seems very obvious to me that the next 2 to 3 decades, there's a very good chance they're going to have some radical reconfiguration by our own hand through these new tools. And I want to study that. And in particular, I'm curious about how people build expertise, put it to work, and so on. At that point, I had a few things I wanted to look into. Persuasion was another one. I was very well counseled on applying to PhD programs. You don't say, I'm only interested in studying X, but skill was in there. I arrived at MIT, and within 6 months, I was going to, in theory, work using these sociometric badges coming out of Sandy's lab. Sandy was one of the people who advocated for me getting let in there. And I, within 6 months, pivoted radically away from that and said, it's robots and AI, but robots especially. And everybody MIT's a place where the people were roughly supportive. Like, okay, sure, that's pretty different, but go for it. So that was like late 2010, early 2011. I just started my first empirical field study of work involving robots, and I haven't looked back.
And you did something in the course of your PhD that few people could claim to have any experience with. You spent a considerable number of hours apparently shadowing surgeons in operating rooms.
Right.
And what did you learn from that, and why were you doing it?
Well, so this is a research method. So in the 40s, maybe 50s, some folks who were interested in business dynamics, organizational dynamics, decided that a useful way of gathering primary data would be to steal the anthropologist's playbook and just use it inside organizations. There was some work in this vein in the, say, 30s and 40s, studying things like street gangs, other organized human activity in civilized sort of first world settings. But maybe 50s really is when ethnography, is the name of that technique, became a standard primary data collection mechanism for studying how organizations run and why they run the way that they do. It's a nice complement to sort of more quantitative studies when it's time to, there's something new going on and you need to understand even what it is at all and why it might work the way that it is. So building new theories rather than testing them. And so this was one of the methods that I was trained in at Sloan at MIT. And because I had questions about like, okay, we've got robots getting thrown in the mix in surgery. How is that changing the way people are building skill? The only plausible way to get an answer to that is to get a reasonably representative sample of organizations or settings where the technology is being deployed and gather systematic data firsthand, by hand, about how the work's getting done. Who's saying what to who's doing what, how is the space set up, what are people doing on their off time? You have to get really rich and longitudinal data to start to answer these questions. And surveys are not going to cut that. You can't gather Excel spreadsheets with data on operative time and stuff like that. You have to go in the room. So to do this, it was 2.5 years at 5 different hospitals, primarily standing in scrubs. I had to clear all of these studies with 5 different hospitals, institutional review boards, and then show up, getting scrubs, having a badge, access, and so on, with a surgical instrument stand. Picture a sort of stainless steel adjustable height stand that normally would have instruments on it. My instrument was a laptop. And I just would plunk that down, plug it into a ceiling electrical jack, and type. I can type pretty fast. Just every bit of data that I could possibly get on who's doing what, how's it all going. I had a couple of things to focus on, but one of them was, how is this trainee learning how to do this activity? So I focused a lot of my note taking there. I don't know, somewhere in the order of 10,000 pages worth of data by the time it was done, which looks like a Hollywood movie script. I mean, it's like I had set up auto-coding stuff in words so that individuals, as they were speaking, I could just hit enter and enter a couple characters. It would enter the person's name. I could type what they were saying. It was all time-stamped, so I could calculate how long it took to do certain things.
Mm.
So that I could still write papers off of that data. It's a lot of data.
Yeah.
But that plus spending time with people outside of the OR and just interviews and so on, like, why did you do it that way? Or what are you doing this seems really tough to learn. What else are you doing? That kind of stuff.
And they got used to you being there, like the fly on the wall. Apparently you were quoting some of them in a fairly salty conversation. Yep. At one point. But then a robot came into the mix, and you describe at length something called the Da Vinci surgical robot, which maybe could give us a description of what that thing looks like,
Sure.
Because it sounds impressive, and what effects you observed that having on the operating room dynamics.
Yeah. I took one look at the previous study I had done was also in a hospital, and someone just walked me into the OR and showed me one of these systems. There's 3 components to this surgical system, but it enables keyhole surgery. You might have, in the 80s and 90s, we got laparoscopic surgery, which is just instead of a large incision and opening up the body to work inside of it with your bare hands and some tools, handheld tools, you make small keyhole incisions. Into one of them goes a device called an insufflator, which basically fills the body cavity that you're operating in with inert gas. It's usually CO2. And then you have other instruments that are 14 to 18-inch sticks with instruments on the end that have hand manipulators on the outside. This is very physically taxing work to do, but it is dramatically less damaging to the patient. So a lot less pain, a lot shorter hospital stays and so on. But you might imagine you stick one of these instruments through a single keyhole incision, and down is up inside the patient. Left is right, because you're operating on a fulcrum. It's like rowing in a boat, and you're doing that with 2 hands. So it took this sort of prodigious skill to do this work really well. And so it was a huge bottleneck for the profession. The robot was an answer to that problem. So you have this 4-armed 1,000-pound robot that you roll up to the patient. The 4 arms go in through keyhole incisions. One of them has a stereoscopic camera on it. So it has 2 little cameras. You can rest your face in the second part of the robot, which is a control console, another about 1,000-pound object. That is, you can imagine sort of an extraordinarily glorified immersive reality Xbox controller. So you put your face in and you get a stereo 3D view inside the patient from one of those arms that has the camera on it. And you have these 2 hand controllers called masters, which have multiple degrees of freedom and allow you to do things like move the instruments around and so on. But the key is, algorithmically, your motion is processed so that right is right and left is left now. So now you can kind of get back to this intuitive mode, thus Intuitive Surgical is the name of the company that made this robot. But you can control the robot in a much more normal way, and your motion is scaled. So an inch outside the patient is a millimeter inside, and you get a magnified view if you wish. And also you can control 3 arms with 2 hands. So one of them you can use to draw up some tissue and hold it, and then pause that arm while you take control of the other 2 to operate away. The practical effect of, I did not know this in advance. So I just looked at that and I thought, that is very different. That's almost like I learned to play tennis in real life, and now I'm going to learn to play tennis in a video game setting, and I have this very different controller, and it's the same game, but boy, oh boy, is the modality different. How do I learn how to? So I had this sort of learning question that was abstract. It turns out what I found after about a year's worth of being in the OR is that the 3 arms, the practical effect of that is that the senior surgeon can operate without assistance. They can do the whole procedure themselves. Normally, in all surgery up to that point, even laparoscopic, you need a second person to be doing complementary actions to allow you to get your surgery done. Old-fashioned, it's 4 hands in the patient. In laparoscopic procedures, it's, the resident might be holding a camera. But bottom line, the trainee who's trying to learn how to become you is mandatory in the procedure. So for a 4.5 or 6 hour procedure, they must be working the whole time. And the learning is very rich. It doesn't have to be, but your chances of, if you have to, you're in the action, you're going to learn a lot. The literal opposite. It was a wasteland for these residents watching them. They would have 2 consoles if they're lucky, 2 control consoles, so you could swap control from one to the other to control the robot. And they would just go, after setting the robot up and attaching it to the patient, they would both go to their consoles, and that resident would just look in the console and get to do basically nothing for 4.5 hours. They just watch. So that was a shocking revelation. I just sort of realized, wow, these people are not learning. They're just not. Like 15 minutes, if you're lucky, you get to operate during that 4.5 hour procedure.
So you saw the whole apprenticeship model being disrupted here, not in a good way. Actually, one thought I want to inject, nothing about what you described with the robot requires the operator to be co-located with the machine. If you had a high enough bandwidth connection, they could be in different cities. Is that a thing that happens?
Yeah, it was actually the initial use case for the first computer vision guided surgery funded by DARPA, the Defense Agency's sort of research arm in the States, for remote cardiac surgery on wounded soldiers. So the legal problems and barriers associated with doing that work and managing liability is what stopped the remote surgery thing from really becoming reliable. It's absolutely technically feasible. In the same way that remote control of a plane, a passenger airliner, is very straightforward and feasible right now. You don't need the pilot on board at all. And seems quite unlikely that that pilot's going to go away. And in the same way, having the surgeon in the room, by the way, the part of the reason for that is it's the same reason as for a pilot. If something goes wrong robotically, like you nick the iliac artery, which is a high blood pressure, high throughput, there's a few, inferior vena cava, there's a few places where if you accidentally nick that, that patient could die within 4 to 6 minutes. Very quickly, because they'll just bleed out. The solution is very fast and very effective, which is get the robot undocked from them, cut the patient open, convert to open methods, and get a vascular surgeon in there just to sew up that artery, to get a little graphic.
Yes, got it. So let's get back to what was happening with apprenticeships, because basically the model that was growing new lead surgeons was broken. What did that make you think?
Well, so right around the time that I noticed that block, I also was proud to have found 3 residents across 5 hospitals who seemed to have found a way around that block. They were granted huge amounts of time to operate, incredible leeway to take over and run the procedure, essentially. And they seem to have learned in comparable ways, different, very different than the sort of standard, normal, required curriculum. And that was a little sort of, I brought that back to my committee, both like, here's this block to participation for these people are optional now, they're not getting to learn. And here's a few that seem to be doing it independently of one another and in very consistent ways. And my committee rightly said, well, that's not science quite yet. You would need, say 20x that volume of people who were managing to learn anyway. And you have about a year left in your dissertation. So do nothing but go try to find these aberrant learners and try to study them in a way that would blind you to whether they were one of these people or not. So that way it'll be defensible. And that's exactly what I did. So I got a total of 18 teaching hospitals enrolled around the States out of the top, say 20, 25, and asked senior surgeons at each of those institutions to introduce me to 2 residents, one of whom was learning really fast and doing exceptionally well, and one of whom was merely average. But don't tell me which is which. And I'm going to interview them both, ask them all the same questions, and then after I gather that data, you can unblind me. And it turned out that the findings in that core paper that was published in 2019 is that all of them, at all 18 institutions, about 1 in 8, 1 in 10, it's probably lower at lower quality institutions, but I don't have that data. But all of them were doing the same 3 things in the abstract in exactly the same sequence, and none of them had consulted with any others. So that was very strong evidence that there was this other way of learning going on that was working in this weird context. And the paper was about like, look, here's this block, but that's not interesting. In fact, we know that with new technologies, things get hard for a while. But the fact that also at T0, right at the beginning, more or less, like soon after this profession got its hands on this thing, their apprentices had already found this shadow way forward to build their skill in spite of the normal curriculum. So that was the finding in that paper.
And obviously we're generalizing this beyond surgeons now for the audience to a great many other fields. So you call this shadow learning. You also refer to something called productive deviance. Are they the same thing?
Productive deviance is a broader category than shadow learning. So there are other ways that you can bend and break rules to get valuable outcomes. That one of the valuable outcomes is learning or skill development. That's shadow learning. So that's a subset of productive deviance. Somebody who sort of inspired me in this direction is a guy named Ethan Bernstein. He's a faculty member at Harvard Business School. He did a study. I mean, we have studies going back decades of this kind of thing, of electronics manufacturing in China, on mainland China, where the most productive lines, if you were the ones where they put up a screen around them so that the workers couldn't be seen. And it turns out that they were doing a bunch of workarounds to get their components assembled that ran contrary to standard operating procedures, like wearing these gloves to reduce conductivity and so on. They just didn't do that. So, and it had no net effect. It was supposed to be important, but practically it wasn't. They had found ways around that. So humans, wherever there is organized anything going on, you can assume that some small subset of the humans involved have found tricky ways to get it done better, faster, cheaper, and that run contrary to rules. So it's productive, right, but it's deviant.
And we make rules and handbooks for people who aren't as smart as the people writing the handbooks, but then there are some people who are smarter than them, and when they can go outside of the scripted procedures, they do a better job. That's what it comes down to?
That's the idea, and there's this constant tension. I mean, some workarounds are worse, right? So it's not as if by deviating, you're necessarily going to improve on the standard operating procedure. In fact, in most cases, you won't. In most cases, it's a waste. It'll slow things down, or it'll just be, I like to do it better this way, even though it's no better, right? So it's not super common that that kind of deviance is productive, but it's surprisingly common, I think. That's like a 50, 60-year-old finding. And so this is, in a certain sense, the science around deviance and its value has been pretty well established since the late 40s in the sort of studying the industrial context. And this is, I'm going to put big air quotes around this. The simple move is just to say, well, couldn't that also be true with respect to how we build skill at work? That had never quite been asked before. And so that's what the paper was about.
Let's talk about the apprenticeship model, because apprenticing is, at least to me, it seems that's a model for people to learn things that are too complicated to put in procedures and handbooks. No one's ever figured out how to do that, but if you learn by watching someone do that, be they a surgeon, a master blacksmith, or whatever, then they pick it up by osmosis. How do you see the model of apprenticeship changing or being threatened by modern developments in practices in the business place?
Yeah, so the primary sort of cause of the trouble for skill development for novices coming up the chain in surgery was that they became optional participants in the work. And as soon as that finding was inked, more or less, in, say, 2019, I spent the next chunk of time, about 2 years, trying to assess the validity of that finding across really different occupations, professions, technologies, industries, stuff like that. And that work continues. I'm now above 30 different occupations, industries, and so on, everything from bomb disposal to policing to investment banking. And especially now, I haven't done no research on this directly, but the anecdotal evidence is very strong. This is on strong display with ChatGPT. Bottom line, these intelligent technologies, robots, AI being key examples, they allow a single expert to do better, faster, with less help. It's much more self-serve technology than the previous version. In a way, that's sort of the definition of automation. You invest in something that allows that single expert to do more better. And the expert loves that deal. In the case of robotic surgery, they can control more of the process and see it through further with less attention costs and so on. They can sort of manage their own task. The organization that hires that expert absolutely loves it because it's basically like swapping capital for output. You just give the expert a better tool and they do better. So both of those parties have strong incentives to see the immediate value that comes from that. But if it is self-serve, then practically, and I've now seen this in data from many contexts, that novice who is trying to become that expert becomes optional to some greater degree. In some cases, it's complete and extreme. Doesn't always happen, but it mostly is what's happening. And that means professions, organizations everywhere are kneecapping the next generation of talent.
Right. And one of those that occurred to me a while ago that I'd like to validate is trial lawyers. The people that argue in court is an unautomatable skill to a large extent. But paralegals, the sort of baby trial lawyers, their work is being automated at a phenomenal rate. And again, something I'd like to validate, but I've seen numerous examples of things that are entry-level tasks in the legal profession that are now automated. And so then who would go into that field? And then where do tomorrow's trial lawyers come from?
Right. Yes. In fact, I have data on the legal profession and paralegals specifically in the book. That's one of the contexts that I went and looked. Law firms are recently have been reducing their investment in a variety of aspects of organizational operations, except for one, which is automation via software. That has been spiking quite a bit, and it's exactly the tale that you tell. The connection between paralegal and lawyer is less direct because many of them, it's not as if you must be a paralegal to then become a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in many cases, a paralegal can never become a lawyer. They have to go off to law school to become so. That's not the reality, really, though. There is this sort of shadow apprenticeship channel that goes through being a paralegal or some equivalent for a little bit, and then you go to law school, perhaps contemporaneously with being that paralegal, and then you can move on to being an attorney. So it's functionally similar, anyway, to this residency.
Right. If you're hanging around attorneys all day, it's going to occur to you much more naturally that maybe you want to be one.
Yep. And when you actually hit the ground as one, you will be miles ahead of an attorney who's just coming out of law school and has never really worked in a firm.
Right. So what other professions did you study where you observed this dynamic?
So personally, I just finished about 9 months or a year ago, a nearly 3-year-long stint in the warehousing industry. And so had exposure to multiple occupations and professions there, everything from entry-level warehouse workers. You wouldn't call that a profession. I wouldn't either, but it's an occupation to be sure. But also there's an entire host of professionals involved in mounting that kind of an organizational effort. So everything from industrial process engineers to mechanical engineers. So this whole sort of engineering side of that ledger, as well as the sort of operations management side of things, everything from a direct manager of personnel on the ground to supply chain managers, but then also HR, sort of the kinds of internal functions, talent management related functions, and so on. In every single profession, it wasn't the primary question in those studies always, but in every one of those contexts, the drive to self-serve, less connection with your immediate potential mentor or supervisor. And, if you're in a domain expert area like engineering or something, that expert is just going to be much more applied on task. Notice that for sure in the industrial engineering and process engineering groups inside these kind of firms.
That's the end of the first half of the interview. Next half comes next week. How to get Matt's book and your free chapter can be found at https://aiandyou.theskillcodebook.com with a link in the show notes and transcript. That's https://aiandyou.theskillcodebook.com. We're really getting into the topic of the future of work in a big way in this interview, and that's a topic that's getting huge exposure. It strikes me that so many businesses have striven for so long to make their people behave like ever more efficient machines proceduralizing everything possible, then we shouldn't be surprised that machines are now doing those things. Now, don't get me wrong, checklists can be a good thing. I use checklists for my interview setup, for creating invoices and other things, and airplanes would be a lot less safe if pilots didn't use checklists for everything. You name it, they have a checklist for it. Even something catastrophic like all engines failing at once, they pull out a checklist. But if you look now at where AI is being leveraged the most, we see lots of use occurring in automating those kinds of tasks. That's where AI agents are going to get the most use. And, well, good. How much do you enjoy following checklists anyway? If an AI can do it, and this is where we don't want to think about doing this with airplanes just yet, then so much the better, because I'll bet that you don't feel like you're most human when you're following a checklist. Even if it's something sensual like making a recipe, I bet you come alive more when you're tasting and testing and adjusting. So the places where we preserve and build up human involvement in work need to be where checklists don't work. And that means developing those soft human skills like leadership and communication. Of course, those have always been important. But think about job postings you've seen lately. How much emphasis do they put on those skills? And how much on a laundry list of hard skills that AIs are increasingly learning how to be good at? Food for thought. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, General Motors' Cruise autonomous cars, which were once pulled out of San Francisco and everywhere else after a pedestrian was struck and dragged under one, are back in Phoenix now. But, and it's a big but, they will be in manual mode, so not actually driving themselves. You may wonder, why? It's like a Zen question. If a cruise car isn't self-driving, is it really still a cruise car? The answer is that humans will be driving these cars around Phoenix to map the roads out. Obviously, a very cautious return to roads that are a respectable distance from San Francisco and its reporters. Although you've got to wonder, didn't Waymo already map the streets of Phoenix to the nearest millimeter? And wouldn't they have been happy to sell that data to GM for just a little bit less than it cost GM to do it themselves? Anyway, this latest chapter in the one step forwards, one step backwards, two step sideways progress of robotaxi deployment, brought to you by General Motors. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Matt, when we'll talk more about what AIs do to the mentoring and learning pipelines in the workplace, and how education should pivot to deal with the changes to the future of work. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.